Hello, I'm Jennia D'Lima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. Even if we write daily, how often do we think about what writing is or what can be capable beyond getting our name out there, maybe landing us a coveted byline or book deal? And do we look at it as communication only, or do we think of it in other terms? Today's guest, philosopher and author David Arndt, says that writing at its best resists common philosophies of truth, goodness, and beauty, and he'll be explaining to us just what he means by this as we dive into the philosophy of writing. Well, first, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, I did read your recently published essay, and I would love to start with that because I think it gives so many jumping off points from what you talk about more broadly or more in depth in your book. And you open it by talking about writing in school and how it
Mhm.
felt like just a hoop you had to jump through. So, how did that then lead you to looking into philosophy?
I went to a big public high school that was just not very good. And so, like, English class was taught by having the teachers give lectures on books. And so, the smartest thing you could do was to take meticulous notes on the lectures and then study them the night before and then regurgitate them on the exams. But if you wanted to get good grades, the stupidest thing you could possibly do was to actually read the books for yourself and try to understand them and see how they illuminate the world and how they speak to you, and then to try to gather your thoughts and lay them out in writing. So writing, again, was just a performance that we had to put on to please our teachers. So when I was young, I just could not have cared less about writing. It was just not something that mattered to me.
Yeah.
But eventually, just in a very instinctive way, when I had an insight that I thought was important, I would write it down. Or when there was a question that I thought was important, I would write it down. So I kind of instinctively, without really knowing what I was doing, got in the habit of just writing about things that I didn't understand. We'll put it that way. And that seemed like something completely different from the writing I was supposed to do in school, because it's not like I had a clear idea of what I wanted to say and then I was going to put it in writing. I started writing precisely because I didn't know what to think about some sort of subject that attracted my interest.
Right, and that almost seems to go against that advice you hear so much, which is write about what you know. And here you are writing down things you don't know or that you know very little about. So, how do you think that those are both different sides of looking at writing, but also similar?
I think that the grain of truth in write about what you know is write out of your own experience, right? Your writing will move towards truth the more it adheres to the world as it appears in your own experience. We'll
Hmm.
put it that way. But the thing is, the way the world appears is mostly opaque to us. I mean, we mostly live in darkness. So you want to write about what you know in the sense that something that's rooted in your own experience, but our experience is not transparent. So I think we
Right.
need to use writing to try to, move away from the superficial understanding that we share in common, and to try to move towards something that we don't fully grasp, or for which we don't fully have words. And
Mhm.
to try to find the words that can grasp that and bring it to light. So I think writing at its best is not just a form of communication, but a way of trying to find words for something that we've experienced, but that we don't really fully understand.
Yes, I wrote down that you used that quote too, making visible what was unseen.
Hmm.
And I know there have been so many times, even just myself, when I'm reading something and there's a line or a paragraph that puts something into words that I've felt, but I've never been able to fully describe. And then you almost just need to have that moment of, it's like an epiphany
Hmm.
where you better, like you were saying, you're understanding yourself, you're understanding truth, or at least what the truth is to you. So I don't
Hmm.
know if you mean a general truth or a universal truth or a personal truth.
Excellent question. I think so. Maybe I'll just give an example to start with. I think the example for me is Marcel Proust, and especially for the famous episode where he eats a cookie and suddenly has this involuntary memory of his whole childhood. And he said, something happened to me and I didn't know what it was, right?
Mm,
And I was tempted just to dismiss it, but it seemed so important. I had to, like, take my attention away from everything and just concentrate on what that was in order to try to bring that sensation to light. So Proust's writing is just extremely precise in his descriptions of his own experience, but he's always aiming at something that's universal. He's trying to explicate the phenomenon of involuntary memory, something that I think that all of us experience from time to time. This sudden moment where it seems like your past comes back to you in an
Yeah.
involuntary way. So I think what great writers can do is start with the singularity of their own unique, particular, irreplaceable experience. And then in trying to illuminate that, also illuminate something that's universal and common to all human beings.
Do you think that's then what leads to someone saying that they found writing relatable or a character relatable because they do tap into at least maybe some small segment of universal truth that we then identify?
Yeah. The phrase universal truth is a fraught phrase, but I think
I'll
the
just say
important thing
some
is
form of truth.
I think we need to start from the actual experience. If I may, actually, I'm going to quote something
Yeah.
from Bell Hooks, a great African American writer. She talks about how when she was just depressed and just felt totally alone in the world and totally unseen, she went to a retreat for her church, and somebody gave her a copy of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And
Mhm.
she writes, she gave me Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I'm drowning, and his words come to rescue me. He helps to make sense of the pain I feel. Now it's Rilke who speaks to me and urges me to go into myself and find the deeps into which my life takes rise. At last, I'm not alone. I have been seen.
Mm, yeah.
I just think that Bell Hooks was really describing something important. And it's, I don't know if there's universal truth, but there's definitely the power of written text so that something written by a bohemian white male author in the early 20th century can speak to a working class black girl in Kentucky, right? In a way that makes her say, I feel like I've been seen. I'm no longer alone in the world. So
Hmm.
it's a very powerful, I don't want to make big pronouncements about universal truth, but I think that what we need to pay very close attention to is that experience of text speaking to us across time and across culture.
Hmm. And then how do you think that we end up losing that when we look at writing as only a form of communication?
I think that the way that we are taught to write in college is we're taught to write scholarly or scientific papers, right? So you're taught to write, a paper is a way to communicate knowledge, right? But the idea is you're supposed to go out and do research and tabulate results and formulate your knowledge and then write a paper in order to communicate that knowledge to other people. But that the truth of that writing is supposed to be impersonal, right? It's supposed to not depend on your own personal situation and your own
Hmm.
personal experience, right? And that's great. That's very important. All students should learn to write that way. But I just want to say that that's not the only way of writing. The way that I was taught to write in classes was you come up with a thesis and then you provide lots of evidence to show that that thesis is true. So you're trying to demonstrate some sort of proposition. That's great. That's wonderful. But in my classes, I also ask students to formulate not a thesis, but a question, right? There's something that they want to understand, and they can understand it by having a dialogue with some sort of important text. They read the text closely and see what the text says to them about that question. And then in response to the text, they can work out their own understanding of the question. So that kind of essay does have a thesis, but the thesis is the conclusion. It comes at the very end of the piece of writing and not at the beginning. So I think it's more conducive to meditative thinking to not start with a thesis and try to prove it, but to start with a question and try to work out a deeper, clearer, more refined understanding.
Right. So you're really encouraging them to do what you did on your own without someone's guidance when you were in high school.
Yeah, it's something that they want to do naturally too. And I tell them that as long as they're writing about some text we've read in class, I want them to try to find a question that really matters to them, right? The
Mhm.
important thing is that they genuinely care about the topic that they're writing about and that they're using writing as a way to work out they use writing not as a way to put on a performance of like erudition or theoretical sophistication, but they use writing as a way to work out their own authentic understanding and try to in some way articulate the truth of their own experience.
Have you ever had students who struggled with this just because it might feel anathema to everything they've learned in higher education so far?
Yeah, I have students who can't quite believe me when I say I want you to start an essay with a question. They're just like, I'm just going to keep doing what they told me in high school, right? Because I don't want to get in trouble. So sometimes it takes a couple drafts for them to really believe that I'm serious when I say number one that they should start with a question and something they want to understand, but also they have a hard time believing that I'm actually interested in what they think, right? And
Oh,
they have a
right,
hard time
rather than those
believing
regurgitated
that
answers.
yeah, that I don't just want them to show that they've been listening to what I've been saying, but that they're actually trying to move towards a more authentic understanding.
Which goes into something else you talk about, which is writing as the dialogue with yourself, which it seems like that's also what you are trying to get them to do, even if that's something that is so counter to everything they've been taught.
Yeah, I think it's because I'll say this in education, we tend to think of it in just one dimension, like a movement from ignorance to knowledge. You walk into the class and you don't know something, and hopefully at the end of the semester you walk out and you already know something. But there's the most important questions in life, like what is friendship or what is justice or what is democracy, what is love. It's not like we're totally ignorant of those things. We start with an average understanding, that is an understanding that's relatively shallow, confused, vague, simplistic, and crude, right? And
Mhm.
so we want to move it not just from ignorance to knowledge, but from an average understanding to a genuine understanding. That is, we really understand it, in a way that's deep, clear, precise, complex, and refined. So that's a second movement that has to be made. I would say that writing the way it's taught in school is just one dimensional. You're trying to just continue. It's a very good project to contribute to general enlightenment by producing original research and publishing it so that others can know. But I think there's a second dimension which tends to be neglected, which is moving from an average understanding to a deeper understanding. And if I may say, I think there's also a third dimension, which is in order to move towards a genuine understanding, I think we need to move towards a more authentic understanding. That is, away from just the understanding we've absorbed from people around us and towards something we've worked out through our own experience and our own reading and our own reflection and our own writing. So I think the
Right.
only way actually to move towards a more genuine understanding is making your discourse more authentic. That is more speaking out of your own experience and your own thought and not just repeating what other people have
Yeah,
said.
I was just thinking that as you were saying that, right? Because you do hear a lot of people, even on panels and things, maybe where you might ask a question and it feels a little bit like you're having something parroted back to you, or that this is just their go-to answer that they've relied upon for the past 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it is, but it hasn't evolved as they have grown in their own understanding or their own understanding of the world and themselves has changed. And so
Yeah,
it does feel like it misses some of that layering or nuance, or again, that we would have our knowledge increase with time and further exposure to other people, more experiences, whatever it is.
yeah. I think for some of my classes, I have students write senior essays, and other professors help students write their senior essays. And I think the mark of a bad senior essay advisor is that all the student essays end up sounding like the advisor, right? And
Right.
a good senior essay advisor has students write essays where each student sounds like him or herself. Yeah. And I think
Yes.
that I was very lucky. I studied with a philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who was very famous and well known. And in graduate school, there's a lot of pressure to try to display how brilliant you are and how smart you are, and to try to win the endorsement of your professors. But he was completely uninterested in hearing students parrot what he had already said. Like he really cared about having students find their own questions and work out their own thoughts. So from Derrida, I got more feedback on my writing than from any teacher or professor I've ever had. 2 or 3 pages of notes that showed that he had read the essay very carefully and saw where I was going, but also saw where I was taking things for granted or missing questions or skipping over things. So he would write questions to try to nudge me
Mhm.
towards what I cared about, but never towards what he cared about or what he thought.
It feels a bit like editing too, where we are asking questions when we're doing a developmental level edit. But again, it's not because that's where we want the story to go or what we believe the author should care about. Right. It's pulling forth what you care about in the story, what you want reflected, how you want this character to come across, whatever it is. So it feels very
Right.
similar in that way.
There's what the writer wants, but I also think sometimes there's what the story wants
Ah,
or what the essay
yes.
wants, right? That sometimes you have an idea for a story or for an essay, and you're trying to force things to go in a certain direction, and eventually you realize that like it's never going to work that way, and like the story is kind of telling you what it
Mhm.
wants to be, and you have to listen to that. So it's not just I don't think writing is just a matter of doing whatever you want, right? It's mostly trying to attend to reality and attend to the logic of storytelling as well in a way that helps you to bring something into being, which is not an arbitrary creation, but it's something that has a truth and a logic of its own.
When you were talking about the different types of maybe senior advisors and the types of essays we might see coming from their students at the end of that period, it made me think too about audience and who you're writing for. So it would feel in those first cases that yes, they are writing for the professor and to try and get some applause on their end or metaphorical applause anyway. Versus, right, you're writing for yourself or you are writing for your own understanding. You're not anticipating their reaction with every line you're putting down or your word choice or who you quote or don't quote. But so what do you think then shifts when we aren't writing for this audience of one or even imaginary audience of whoever. Instead, we're just writing to write.
I think so the dedication of my book is to my daughter. So I always had her in mind when I was writing that she's 17, so she's just getting interested in really serious reading and philosophy. So it's to her as she is now, but it's also to her as she will be when I'm no longer here. So I think it's good to write in a way that you have at least one person in mind that you want to. There's something you really want to communicate, and you at least if no one else reads your book, you'll be happy if that one person can read what you've written and see what you see because of that. If I may go back to academic writing, I think something that people don't appreciate is I think your dissertation and the first academic book you write you're aiming at about 10 readers, which is the people who will hire you for a certain job or who will give you tenure, right? You're not writing for a general audience. You're writing for a group of specialists who have immense power over your life and your career. So that was my first book was a book on Hannah Arendt, German American political theorist. I tried to write for a general audience, but you can't keep out of your mind that you're writing for experts too.
Mhm.
But once you get past your first book, I think you have a lot more freedom to write about what you want. The thing that struck me was Michel Foucault said that, this is something he said near the end is, the more books he wrote, the more he wrote books in order to work out his thoughts on some sort of topic that he hadn't fully worked his thoughts out on. May I quote from Foucault? Because I think this is something that I read when I was
Of
in
course.
graduate school that made a huge impression on me. Foucault said, "The books that I write constitute an experience for me that I'd like to be as rich as possible. An experience is something you come out of change. If I had to write a book to communicate what I already thought, I'd never have the courage to begin it. I write because I don't yet know what to think about a subject that attracts my interest. In doing so, the book transforms me, changes what I think. As a consequence, each new work profoundly changes the terms of thinking which I had reached with the previous work. When I write, I do it above all to change myself and not to think the same thing as before." I remember reading that in graduate school and thinking, this is why we write, like not just to put on a performance for other people or even to contribute to the general store of knowledge, but to try to work out our own understanding of things.
Which is something that you wrote in the essay, which was this alone is what it means to live as an artist and understanding as in creating. So I can see now the origins of that, where
Yeah,
that line comes. Yes.
that's also from Rilke. Rilke writes about that in his letters to a young poet, the book that Bell Hooks read and that made her feel seen and no longer alone in the world. Yeah.
Well, you also said that writing is often reduced to technique. So what do you think that we miss when we do this?
So this comes out of in part because when I was in graduate school, there was a MFA program in creative writing and a PhD program in literature and literary theory. And there was this huge gulf between these two programs. One, the MFA program had workshops where you were taught the craft of writing, and there was a very strong emphasis on craftsmanship. And in the PhD program, nobody cared about writing at all. I guess they thought about it theoretically, but it wasn't something that people cared a great deal about practicing. What's interesting is that I don't think there's never been a book called Philosophy of Writing. There's like philosophy of film and philosophy of
Oh,
dance and philosophy of
yeah.
science and philosophy of law. You go to an internet encyclopedia of philosophy, philosophy of writing is not a topic that's generally recognized.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because there's a technical view of writing that writing is just a tool of communication. And that technical view is grounded in, I think, in a sense that truth, you can't accept something as true unless it's just so clear and so distinct that it's absolutely certain. So there's the notion that writing may be an instrument of thought to move to clear and distinct knowledge, but it's only an instrument, right? And it's not something really worth thinking about. So at UC Irvine, where I was a graduate student, there was all the humanities took place in a building called the Humanities Office Building, which had 4 floors. And the top floor was the philosophy department. And the third floor was French and Italian. And the second floor was history. And the ground floor was English. And then the writing program was located in the trailers out back. So I think that kind of shows you how writing is regarded, that it's considered more of a skill that you use to master some sort of tool of communication, but it's not really something that's worth thinking about in itself.
Yeah, that leads me to something else you said about how it's not just used for communication, but also for transformation. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that also.
Yeah, this comes back to what Foucault said. It also comes back to something that was said by Gloria Anzaldúa, if I may
Hmm.
quote her. She was a Chicana writer, and she said something that also really made a huge impression on me. She wrote, "Why am I compelled to write? I write to record what others erase when I speak, to rewrite the stories others have miswritten about me and about you, to become more intimate with myself and you, to discover myself, to preserve myself, to make myself. The act of writing is the act of making soul."
Mm,
So I think she's on to something very important, which is that who we are is in large part the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we interpret ourselves. We're self-interpreting animals. And so if you change the language, if you clarify and deepen and refine the language in which you understand yourself,
hmm.
you're going to change yourself also. And if you can refine the language in which you understand the emotions that you're feeling, I think it actually affects the emotions that you feel.
Yeah.
So I think that in the same way that I think reading change, if you spend 10 years reading very deeply, it'll change you as a person. I think the same thing is true of writing. Not just cranking out emails, but if you sit down every day and try to step aside from everyday life and descend in towards the depths, towards what really matters in life, and write about what you see and try to put it into words in a way that other people can see it. If you make it a regular practice in your life, it'll change you as a person.
Yeah, I like what you said about using words or even being able to name emotions because that reminds me of studies on language and different languages and how they shape our viewpoints and so much of our worldview. And I can't remember the exact examples now, but they were about parenting. And it was something about, watching the baby versus babysitting or spending time with versus investing time with, and how we'll sometimes have these common phrases that we use, which are maybe they have a negative connotation to us in some way, even though we're not really thinking about it, or the language is filled with judgment, either good or bad, and how that too influences our perception. And so I think it's the same thing when we learn to use a different word, or we learn there is a different word, even because we might not have even realized there was another way of expressing it. And then suddenly we begin to think about whatever it was differently than we had up until that point.
Yeah, I think that if you write every day and you try to really get at the truth of your own experience, it helps you become your own person more. I think when we start out in life, we're so much under the influence of our parents and our family and our environment. We tend to like desire what they desire and admire what they admire and want what they want and care what they care about. And I think that what's interesting is when you go back, if you read like Plato's Apology, when Socrates talks about what wisdom is, he says, it's a matter of caring about things that are really worth caring about and not caring about things that are just not worth caring about. So that kind of care is not something that you convey to other people in words directly, right? You can't. This is, I think, what parents understand. If you have children, right, you want your children to live a good life. You want them to care about things that are worth caring about and not care about trivialities. But just saying that in words isn't going to change them, right? So I
Right.
think that if wisdom is a matter of caring and seeing clearly what's worth caring about, then it's not something that can ever be directly conveyed from one person to another. It's something that you have to achieve through work that you do on yourself. And one of the ways that we work on ourselves, I think, is through the practice of writing.
Right. That also reminds me a little bit of a quote you included in the essay too about virtues being good, but it was the actions that come from having those virtues. And that feels related to wisdom as well, because if you care about something, how do you then express that care? You don't
Yeah.
just hold that care and keep it to yourself. If you genuinely care, how we would perhaps define genuine care, it's going to be acted out in some way, or there's going to be an investment made to express it.
Right. This is why reading is transformational also, I think, because if you read an author very deeply, you start to see the world really through their eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the intelligence of their diction and the generosity of attention that they give to reality and the charity with which they write about others, that generosity and that charity and that intelligence, we begin to feel it and absorb it too, I think. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that the most beautiful writing is is not simply aesthetically beautiful, but in the narrative voice, certain virtues shine, honesty and integrity and courage and independence, certain virtues shine through. And so our vision is formed in part by the vision of the writers that we read in a deep way.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we end, is there any idea or belief about writing that you would like to see writers throw by the wayside?
I think there's different kinds of writing. So if you have to crank writing out to get things published or, get things done, that's one kind of writing. But I think that what I care about is a kind of writing which is more like writing as meditation, right? I think that writing is a form of exercise, we'll put it that way. Just as going to the gym forms your body and meditating forms your mind, I think writing can be a form of meditation like that. So all I would say is it's good to suspend your care for the extrinsic rewards of writing and focus on the intrinsic rewards. That writing just has to be something you do for the joy of writing and for the insights that come to you in the process of writing. Because I'll say this, that is sometimes it's really discouraging. Like you're trying to write something and it's not as good as you want it to be. You know it's falling short, but you don't know how.
Mm.
Or you submit something to an editor and you get back remarks that just seem gratuitously hostile and stupid in the review of your writing. And the hardest thing to do, right, is to try to find the grains of truth in that kind of criticism. But so I think it can be very discouraging, but the only way to get past that is just to love writing for the goods that can be reached through the practice of writing itself. We'll put it that way.
Yes. Well, thank you again.
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yes, I agree. And to listeners, thank you for listening. And be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including all of David's links. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd appreciate it if you could rate or review the podcast on Apple or Spotify. Thanks again.